Hey guys, this is Julia Miller, your director and founder of Citywide Singles. I am here right now with Gina, Wendy, and our guest speaker this evening, Jeff Stamm. And Jeff Stamm is a former DEA agent who has been working on the border to help with the drug situation that we've had coming across our southern border. So we're going to give you a little sneak peek of a conversation that we were having with Jeff.
Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What drew you to the DEA?
Well, I'm a resident in California. I started out as a cop years ago out there, and a friend of mine talked me into applying for DEA, and I did back in the 1980s. And back then it was a lot of outlaw motorcycle gangs making methamphetamine. Cocaine was just starting to come on strong from Colombia. The drug issue was truly a burgeoning problem across the country, and it was an exciting career, an exciting agency, and looking back after 31 years in DEA, it was an incredible time with some wonderful opportunities, some exceptional people globally. I had the opportunity to not just work on the Mexican border here in Texas, but 2 foreign countries. I became the Deputy Chief of International Operations in Washington, D.C. So I learned unequivocally that the drug issue is not solely an American problem. It's a human problem, because they've got drug issues in varying degrees throughout the rest of the world. Unfortunately today, it's worse than I've ever seen before, which disappoints me greatly that we don't have a stronger commitment in terms of our federal government right now working to protect our citizens from the drug threat.
What do you see as some of the biggest strongholds that our nation, well, even Texas, what are the biggest strongholds?
Strongholds in terms of adversaries and enemies?
Yes.
Clearly the Mexican drug cartels right now. They are clearly the biggest problem. The border's a sieve. It astonishes me that the leadership in the White House and the Attorney General, even Homeland Security Director Mayorkas, have not led the fine men and women of the Border Patrol, DEA, Homeland Security in a better fashion to protect American citizens. The various Mexican cartels right now have a presence in over 3,000 American cities and towns. They are here solely to sell drugs to Americans.
Wow.
And of course, everybody knows right now the fentanyl crisis has reached catastrophic proportions. But most people don't stop and realize that we also have overdose deaths skyrocketing from methamphetamine, cocaine, and other drugs as well. It is completely out of control, and it's all driven by drug availability from the Mexican cartels pumping drugs into the country from across our southern border.
So how did we get to this point historically?
Well, you could go back to the 1960s to talk about America's current ordeal with drugs, and certainly drugs didn't start then, but it was the sort of inflection point where drugs exploded across our country at the time. Really driven by a couple of factors. We were simultaneously a very rich nation and a very prosperous nation with a lot of free time, and the 1960s generation explored new types of recreation at about the same time modern chemistry was bringing on new forms of psychoactive substances.
LSD.
Also, LSD being one, sure. And then, of course, the baby boom generation exploded at that time, and promising a do-it-if-it-feels-good mentality, do your own thing. We simply allowed drugs to flourish in the 1960s. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of respects, today's levers of power in so many facets of our country are being controlled by flower children from the 1960s.
True.
Oh, wow.
True.
Wow.
Very true. It's ironic that the freedoms that we fought for in World War II have come to haunt us through our wealth and through our freedom. Because it's almost as if this freedom and this wealth that we have has offered us free time and leisure time.
That's a great point. You know, there are so many people that fought for the freedoms that we enjoy today, and in a lot of ways we're squandering them, because freedom cannot exist without first having order in society. That's why law and order always go together. And a lot of people think that someone being free to use drugs because it's own body, it's his own body or her own body, it is completely wrong, because that may be okay for individuals, but for a society, and once again, I haven't seen it just in America, I've seen it all over the world. We see entire civilizations and peoples that are degraded by the drug issue. There's been a number of studies over the years that consistently show that as much as 2/3 of all crime, both property and street crime, is driven in some respect by drug use and drug trafficking. So much of today's crime problem is driven by drugs, and to think that as much as a 2/3 reduction in crime if we just reduce drugs, what a different country this would be.
Right.
It kind of reminds me of the Opium War, wars in China, and how it just makes us so vulnerable on so many levels, and susceptible to a lot of, the danger of things like invasion and all kinds of things. And you mentioned about the homelessness as well. All of these things, just stem from the do your own thing, like you were saying, and it's sad.
Well, that's a good point, and unfortunately, we don't learn from history. The Chinese people were greatly degraded by opium trafficking and addiction back then. The homeless crisis today, a lot of people don't realize that it's really a crisis of addiction. 80% of our homeless people across the country are addicted to opioids. The other 20% to cocaine, meth, weed, alcohol, some combination of all the above. But I just read recently that 65,000 people live in these homeless tent cities in Los Angeles County alone.
Oh my.
Oh, wow.
Ushering in diseases not seen since medieval times. Typhus, bubonic plague, leprosy. Much of them supplied by Mexican drug cartels with fentanyl and heroin, further exacerbating the problem.
Right.
We have to get a handle on that. The most compassionate thing that we can do is to get treatment, even if it's compelled with some of these people. It's not to just let them continue to using drugs as they wish.
So do you see prison terms as a good solution?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not for drug users. Most people think that our prisons are filled with drug users, or
Right.
the war on drugs has spawned mass incarceration. These are dangerous lies. The Bureau of Justice Statistics just put out a recent figure, I think 2020, that across our various state prisons in this country, and there's about 1.4 million people in our state prisons at any given time. Of that total, only 14-point-something% are there for drug violations. And none of them for drug use, very few of them for drug use. They're drug traffickers. But 85% of our state prisoners are there for rape, robbery, murder, aggravated assault, grand larceny. Our prisons are not filled with drug users. They're not even filled with drug traffickers. They're filled with violent criminals and serial thieves.
And a lot of that comes as a result of addiction issues?
Some, sure,
Okay.
but much of that,
murders and rapes and things like that?
yeah, but much of them are what I call lifestyle crimes. They just want to continue to use drugs and do what they want to do as part of their lifestyle. Most drug users are not, in fact, drug addicts. They simply prefer using drugs over a life without them. The personal consequences to themselves and their communities be damned.
Wow.
Right.
Wow. That's horrible. So what other solutions are there besides incarceration? Are there?
Well, just to be clear, I'm not talking about incarcerating drug users, but
Right.
there may be a need for some level of, I hate to say it, to simply be mean to many drug addicts, to compel them into drug treatment. But certainly, with 107,000 Americans dying of drug overdoses last year, that's almost 300 every single day in our country.
Wow.
We have to arrest drug traffickers. We've learned since President Nixon declared a war on drugs, and by the way, a lot of people don't realize that Nixon's main weapon in his war on drugs was actually drug treatment. But we learned that drug treatment doesn't work, neither does drug prevention, unless we simultaneously bring down drug availability on the streets.
Right.
So we have to enforce our legitimate drug laws and put drug traffickers in jail.
Right.
300 Americans every single day are dying from drugs.
Right.
We need a stronger response.
That's huge.
So that's how you would say we win the war on drugs.
Well, I don't think we're ever going to totally win the war on drugs. It's like winning the war on thievery or speeding. It's always going to be there. But we have learned over the past with LSD in the 60s, with cocaine in the 80s and 90s, that law enforcement does in fact work. We can't completely stop it, but we can certainly bring it down to tolerable levels to give our young people a fighting chance, to give treatment and prevention programs a fighting chance.
That's right. But what about the direction we're going? I mean, you hear so much about defund the police. I mean, that is the wrong direction, isn't it?
It's absolutely the wrong direction. And I think it's born from some deep level of animosity toward law enforcement control whatsoever by certain groups out there. But once again, law enforcement has not been engaged in the mass incarceration of mere drug users. The vast majority of cops are merely doing what their democratically elected representatives ask them to do on our behalf. To blame them is a fundamentally misguided way of blaming society for many people's faults.
Wow. And you've written a book, is that right?
I have. When I retired from DEA, I wrote a book called On Dope, Drug Enforcement and the First Policeman. That's not me. That's actually a euphemism, a metaphor for personal responsibility, for the need for somebody to have a good, strong first policeman. Because those who don't have a good developed or underdeveloped first policeman will tend to meet the second one. But it's a book which essentially covers the entire history of the war on drugs. And it's a conservative argument for why we need a good, strong drug law enforcement approach in our country. Why that's the only answer that's going to work.
Okay.
Wow. You know, I was struck by the quote that you mentioned when you spoke to the small group earlier. And I would just love to hear that quote one more time. It's a phenomenal quote. Is it okay?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes, it's fabulous. Can we hear it one more time?
Yeah,
He was a police officer, right, in New York City.
Yeah.
I've spoken to a number of law enforcement audiences over the years, and I always finish on the quote from Teddy Roosevelt, who, in fact, I talk about it because law enforcement is so criticized by so many people across the board. And I just remind them that it's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man or woman who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best, in the end, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this time with Jeff. We are going to be downloading this and later uploading it onto our YouTube channel, which is the Lone Star 355. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and we will hopefully see you next weekend, as we will be having a panel of judges here, as well as Nate Schleyer. I think I'm saying something. Did I say that wrong?
I don't know.
Okay. I don't know if I said that. Anyway, I just know that I love you, and more importantly, God loves you. Have a great evening.